Welcome to our final day of the workshop on cognitivism and the arts. First speaker, whom you're very acquainted with, Monica Jovanovic, Belgrade University, is going to speak to us about productive imagination as a source of meta-aesthetic knowledge. You have the word.
Yeah, thank you very much. So, what is productive imagination? I mean, intuitively, without that the context of Kant's aesthetic. We can call it inventiveness as well. Inventive reading, inventive perceiving of an artwork. Understood that way, productive imagination can help us understand the meaning of metaphors, allegories, symbols, etc. in a given artwork. So if you cannot think out of the box, if you cannot think broadly, if you're capable only of for literal reading of something or understanding of something, you will be incapable of understanding properly and evaluate it properly. So your appreciation of that artwork will be, well, poor at least. So I will give an example for this. René Magritte, this is not a pipe. So if I'm not inventive recipient of an artwork, well, this is not a pipe, it's obviously a pipe. It is realistic representation of a pipe. So for me, if I'm not inventive, it's just something very usual, or it's nothing special. It's even, as a pipe with that title, it's nonsense for me if I'm not capable to introduce some context or some intertextual reading of this. So we need productive imagination for this, I think. And what would be second possible function? There are a lot of them on the side of recipient. I'm not talking about creating works of art, but appreciate them. Identified with fictional characters in a narrative work, novel, play, movie. So here I'm not thinking just about empathy or emotional involvement, but something more fundamental than this. If you're not capable to see the world from other person's perspective, from character's perspective, standing in their shoes, you will not be able to fully understand the work of art. And emotional response will not be appropriate. But that is secondary. This is intellectual capacity to identify with a fictional character. Sometimes there are obstacles, imaginative resistance, for example. If that perspective is morally problematic, that can block your identification with the character. But just basically you should be capable of this. And I think that it is very different kind of a function of productive imagination. And the third possible function, you're standing in front of some painting. It can be a very simple one, or some still life with few elements. There is the vases, for example, and an apple and two books. Nothing more than that. Or you can stand in front of some very complex painting, like Hieronymus Bosch's triptychs. So you have to analyze different details, and you will need time to perceive everything and to experience every detail and their combination. It's demanding. But you can stand in front of some simple work. For example, realistic representation of something very common from real life. But in those cases, of course, in the first example as well, when you have something complex, but also in those cases when you have something very simple in front of you, you can think counterfactually about this. You're standing in front of the painting, you can think about, of course, you can think about context, historical, cultural, history of art, biographical facts, autopoetic remarks, everything external but important for understanding the work of art. Or it could be completely private, like sequence of thoughts which are some free associations or memories. I've been here last month with someone and that. Or, and this is important, you can think about imagined versions of this work. It would be better if it had more elements or less elements. What if this vase was a little bit to the left or to the right? What if colors were a little bit brighter or the opposite? It would be better if there were flowers in that vase instead of being empty. So that means that your judgment of taste is basically, if I'm right, at least sometimes comparative in itself. So comparative judgments are more fundamental than those judgments as you speak. And that is one possible role of productive imagination, which interests me the most here, but just to introduce some context. And what would be some theoretical framework for the third function of productive imagination? I would like to claim that Kant's aesthetics and particularly his conception of free play between understanding and imagination could serve as a conceptual framework, but it would be a rather Kantian version than interpretation of Kant's words. But I have some textual support for this. It's not very strong. You will see the passage, the core passage. And what is precisely the role of productive imagination in the context of Kant's aesthetics? So what is that metaphorical free play between understanding and imagination? And there are different existing interpretations or types of interpretations. Precognitive, multicognitive, metacognitive. This is from Gar's paper on this. This is his classification. So I will give some quotes for the precognitive interpretation. The harmony of imagination and understanding would be a state of mind that satisfies all the conditions for cognition except the final condition that would transform it into actual cognition. So something that precedes cognition, but it's not cognition because cognition is always inferential, or you always subsume, for beginning from the other side, you always subsume individual under the universal. So you always use your determining power of judgment. So this is some quasi-cognition or precognition, and no one knows why, because it has to be without concept, an object of universal liking. Beauty is without concept, an object of universal liking. So it is without concept. This is one possibility. The other one, multicognitive interpretation. The free play of the faculties does not satisfy all but one of the normal conditions for cognition, but rather it satisfies all of them, although only in an indeterminate way. So what does it mean? That understanding proposes different concepts and imagination refuses all of them. There is no matching between that whole united by imagination, that complex intuition, which is the product of productive imagination. This is rather reproductive imagination, if you ask me, and those suggested concepts. This could be frustrating rather than harmonious, I think, and satisfying it would be. So, metacognitive view, that is Gar's own view. The free play should be understood as a state of mind in which the manifold of intuition induced by the perception of an object and presented by the imagination to the understanding is recognized to satisfy the rules for the organization of that manifold dictated by the determinate concept or concepts on which our recognition and identification of the object of this experience depends. And I think that this is quite opposite from Kant's initial intention. So what is the difference between it supervenes on the knowledge, but he wants to claim that you then don't have to know what is it in order to appreciate it aesthetically. If you know what is it, that could be adherent beauty. Sometimes that is relevant, but this is too strong, if you ask me. That I have to know that this is a rose in order to experience it aesthetically. So each of those interpretations or type of interpretations, they have their own flaws, and weak points. But I want to say something just briefly about them all. I think that all of them, what is intention to answer the question, what is a free play between understanding and imagination, to decipher this metaphor, to give some interpretation of it. But basically, they're talking about, they stuck at that point about without conceptless, without concept and object of universal liking. So as if it's only about that, but it is only negative, Kant's negative thesis. And we don't have a positive explanation what is free play. So I suggest that we can separate negative part of his thesis, conceptless, without concept and object of universal liking, and that is just the fact that aesthetic judging is not inferential. And on the other side, that you don't subsume a particular under the universal. Only that. So we can also claim that Kant anticipates anti-essentialism in contemporary aesthetics. So it's non-inferential, it's by acquaintance, not by description, to use Russell's distinction, and it's only that. So it's not rule following, there are no rules, there are no norms, there are no canons for application of aesthetic concepts. But there is a positive part of the story, what it is then. How you judge that something is beautiful then, if you're not following the rule. And you can combine the negative thesis with different explanation of what is free play. So in some contemporary context, you're not we cannot accept Kant's ideas. We can say this is mentalism, it's nothing, what is this? It's a confused way of talking about something that is mental process inside. You need external criteria for inside psychological processes. So we can say that. We can combine non-inferentialism or anti-essentialism with different explanation of aesthetic judging. It could be categorical, for example, but in a weak sense, of course, not to be essentialist. So what is then free play between understanding and imagination? So this is one possible solution, one suggestion. It is a Kantian version. Maybe it's not an interpretation. Productive imagination enables us to play with the object in our thoughts, changing it voluntarily in terms of the formal and semantic qualities of a given work. Not just formal, but also we can change semantic qualities if it's a literary work, if it has that element, that dimension. So we can change basically anything, I mean, imaginatively, not really. Or if we are artists, we can change it in reality. So it wouldn't be then counterfactual thinking, but hypothetical thinking. And what is the role of understanding in this framework? here I was inspired by the 17th paragraph when he talks about idea of one maximum which cannot be specified, which cannot be formulated in language. So some rule, it's vague what it is. We can think about it like a regulative principle, regulative idea. So understanding maybe can provide something like that, but it's kind of standard, but it's not very explicit one. And also the second role of understanding in this framework would be related to individuation of the object, so borders. If I change it in my mind, I'm inventive reader, inventive recipient, and I change it in different ways, just testing my affective reactions. Like, this is good, this gives me that disinterested pleasure, maybe I can recognize these pleasures, maybe it has some specific qualia, or at least I know that it's pleasure. So I can measure the quantity of that pleasure at least. And all of those images, mental images, versions of a real work, I react to them. But if I change a work very much, that will not be that work anymore. It would be something different. So I'm not so comparative judgments. I cannot compare. I can compare it with a version of itself in this, but not with something very different. So it's not. That doesn't have sense. It's not. In this context, but those borders, it's arbitrary how to put them. So maybe this will be another role of understanding, or maybe this will be a role for power of judgment, reflecting power of judgment. I'm not certain, because it's or even determining power of judgment if it has a role. And what would be the role of reflecting power of judgment in this context? To compare those different versions, imaginative versions with the real one. So at the end, you can say this work is the best version of itself. So when that happens, that matching between imagine and something that is real, it's a harmony. It could be understood as a harmony. So it's very free. It's free interpretation of Kant's thought, but still, it's. So what would be some textual support for this, if there is the one at all? If the judgment of taste, the imagination must be considered in its freedom, then it is the first instance taken not as reproductive, as subjected to the laws of association, but as productive and self-active, as the utterance of voluntary forms of possible intuition. And although in the apprehension of a given object of the senses, it is of course bound to a determinate form of this object, and to this extent has no free play as an invention, nevertheless it is still quite conceivable that the object can be provided with a form that contains precisely such a composition of the manifold as the imagination would design in harmony with the lawfulness of the understanding in general, if it were left free by itself. So I think that this has something to do with that interpretation. So the productive imagination is utterance of voluntary forms. I highlight this. Utterance of voluntary forms of possible intuition. So maybe mental images, maybe they could be such voluntary forms of possible intuitions in this context. There is also element of lawfulness of understanding in general, a lawfulness without law, as some say. So the lawfulness of understanding in general, if it were left free by itself, what would imagination design in harmony with the lawfulness of understanding? So two elements of lawfulness, regulative idea and those boundaries or individuation of the object. Maybe that is lawfulness without law, without some general rule or canon. If it were left free by itself, what do you think? Do you have any reactions? So, and this would be some hybrid reading of the free play thesis, because here I use some elements of Upper Kummer's interpretation of the role of imagination in the free play in his neglected but very interesting paper, non-cognitive interpretation of the free play. But he said just that you have that perception of an object, like intuition, and there is also an illicit occasions that aesthetic image, but just one. And we don't know what is aesthetic image. When I say mental image, it's just something quasi-perceptive, right? But when I say aesthetic image, we don't know what is it, and why only one of them. But I was very inspired by his text, and I was even more inspired by Angela Sun counterfactual model of aesthetic judging. She doesn't speak about Kant at all. This is that model, but for me, it should be. We should emphasize the role of imagination. It's so intellectual. It's so rationalist. This counterfactual. She presents her idea in those terms. Just think of counterfactuals, hypothetic works of art, possible worlds, and things like that. So I think that it is a more role of productive imagination than understanding. So when we bring together Angela Sun idea, I'm wondering what will she think about this. Maybe I will check someday. And Upper Kummer's ideas. We have that, and I will call it multi-imaginative view. It has something to do with multi-cognitive view, but it's still different. This view we can contrast with Lara Austeritz's idea that imagination, through the generation of schemata analogs, facilitates the transition from the sensible to the supersensible. For her, it provides a moral image of the supersensible within, and that would be the role of productive imagination. And it's a kind of metaphysical source. It's because now we have that mental image and that moral image of the supersensible within, with the free play, and beauty as a symbol of morality is moral image of the supersensible without, for her. And free play is a kind of portal to those metaphysical things, the most important things, moral ideas for her. So as I understand this wouldn't be it's kind of interpretative role of productive imagination, more than evaluative one, as I understand this. And if we can think about the previous, from the beginning, those roles, first of them was related to interpretation of an artwork, deciphering meaning, uncover different layers of meaning. With that example, this is not a pipe. So this is also interpretative, right? More than, interpretation and evaluation, they are connected, they're inseparable, but this is primarily an interpretative function. The other one, identification with fictional characters, it has to do with our understanding of artworks. when they have that dimension, sometimes that they don't. If I'm in the front of still life, I will not have that kind of dimension in this artwork. But when it's present, it is primarily interpretative, but it serves evaluation, of course, because sometimes what is aesthetically relevant is not on the surface. You should find it in the level of meaning. So, but the third, that counterfactual, I think that this is primarily evaluative role of productive imagination, if it is a role of productive imagination at all. And also with those precognitive, multicognitive, metacognitive interpretation, so a role of productive imagination there is, I think, evaluative. So we can make distinctions between those two and we can bring them together. That means that the interpretation I'm suggesting here, that multi-imaginative view, could be compatible with Lara Oster's view, because they're on the different levels, even though on the face value they look very different. So, and also another difference, analytics or synthetic function of productive imagination. We can read in the literature that the role of imagination is always synthetic, to generate something, to generate that moral image of the supersensible within, to generate that schemata analogs, which are, I understand them as symbols here. So what could be schema analog in this context, when we don't infer that something is beautiful according to some rules? What is the role? I mean, we know from Kant's first critique what is the role of schema. What is the role of schema analogs? When you have that subsumption of individual under the universal. No one knows. But we all have this idea that the role of productive imagination should be synthetic. But maybe it could be analytic and at the same time generative. So in this framework of multi-imaginative view, the role, productive imagination produces something. It is inspired, at least. Not just inspired, but more than that, by that intuition. But it's analytic, not synthetic. So maybe we can introduce this idea in our understanding of free play. So according to this conception, as I said, productive imagination has both the interpretative and evaluative function. Each can be realized in multiple ways, depending on whether we are dealing with natural or artistic beauty, free or adherent beauty, and within artistic beauty, depending on a whole range of specificities regarding style and genre. So, this was brief. Multi-imaginative conception of aesthetic evaluation. So we are now approaching to our final point about how a productive imagination can be a source of meta-aesthetic knowledge. So yesterday we said something about Kant's meta-aesthetic views. We said that he was meta-aesthetic cognitivist. That means that judgments of taste are real propositions according to his view. That they can be true or false, that they can be correct or incorrect. When I say the rose is beautiful, and when I say 2 and 2 makes 4, it's the same, even though I cannot give such a proof for the thesis that the rose is beautiful, because it's non-inferential. So, at the same time, Kant was anti-realist, and that was the problem, because he claims that beauty is not a property of the object. So maybe we can derive something from the third moment. Maybe Formal proposiveness can be some dispositional or relational property of it to just to be truth maker in order to his meta aesthetics to be coherent. So there are several solutions. We were talking about this, and what would be his aesthetic cognitivism that is related to his conception of artworks and aesthetic ideas, aesthetic attributes, motives on some painting, if we are talking about paintings, the cognitive content, what we can learn from art. And this is connected with his moralism as well, his understanding of the relation between ethics and aesthetics, or moral and beautiful. So at the face value, we can those are theories on different levels. There is no any implication, any inference between them. They are not equivalent, of course they are not. And we try to make some implications, yes, to investigate relations. So step by step, when you introduce a little bit of aesthetic truisms, you can come to a meta-aesthetic cognitivism when you start with aesthetic cognitivism. There are some intermediary steps, but just wait. But according to this view, because I'm generally interested in the relations between aesthetic and meta-aesthetic here, so we introduced the distinction between different types of cognitivism. When we applied to this discussion, the first two functions of imagination relate to the cognitive content of the artwork, those interpretative roles of productive imagination. So deciphering meaning can be identification with the character. So that is related to aesthetic cognitivism, I think, because you have to have correct interpretation of an artwork in order to gain some knowledge. Because cognitive content and meaning of an artwork, maybe they're not equivalent, but they're closely related. And your interpretation has to be correct or adequate or plausible. Maybe it has, I think that it has to be true. But now it's not the time for this talk, but it has to be true. Is that what is truth then? Is it some kind of correspondence with facts, or should we understand truth as a coherence, kind of coherence, or pragmatic way of understanding the concept of truth? What would be the most suitable for this context? We will not, but just awareness that we need some good, some adequate interpretation in order to grasp some knowledge from the artwork when that dimension is present at all. In a different way, identifying with fictional characters and deciphering the meaning are important for aesthetic cognitivism. The third function is evaluative, as I said, the counterfactual understanding, the free play, and pertains to the aesthetic judgment of a given work. It's closely related to aesthetic judgment, because the purpose is to understand whether this work of art is good. What does it mean whether it is good or not? In what context? Whether I should compare it with different works in the same category, maybe. Or what would be the real reference here? What would be the standard? So I think that we can say, well, this is just a work in progress to the end, that this function is metacritical, of course. If it's evaluative, it is metacritical. But in a broader sense, we can say that it is, I think that we can, that it is meta-aesthetic because it's related to, and we can add this as well. If we understand the process of aesthetic judgment as a multi-imaginative activity, that process clearly differs in its goal and logic from the process that leads us to the judgment about agreeable. So structure of this process is different, and when it's structured, it is both by acquaintance, but agreeable is more direct than, I mean, that experience is just simple affection, and here we have some structure. And it could be some lawfulness without law in it. And maybe on this phenomenological level, we can make distinction between beautiful and agreeable, and this will be the spirit of Kant's thought, because in the 9th paragraph of his third critique, what is the crucial argument for universal validity of judgments of taste? Just a sequence of mental acts. You have perception, you have that intuition, and after that you have judging, aesthetic judging, which is basically the free play of understanding imagination, this additional element from the 9th paragraph, 9th section. And after that you have disinterested pleasure, and disinterested pleasure is basically some kind of epiphenomenon, some kind of reaction, it supervenes on free play. So this is very important sequence. And when you have just pleasure, like immediate reaction to something, this is agreeable. So here we are introducing a bit of structure, and I think that it goes very well with Kant's general understanding of the phenomenology of aesthetic experience, and how is this related, this psychological side of the story, to his final argument, the judgments of taste are universally valid, because this is differentia specifica, it's subjective generality. This is the most important thing for him. So this would be my idea. So thank you very much.